around the globe.
So what year did the charity start?
About 15 years now. Very high mortality. Condition is
In the sun, I can see you bleeding in the wind.
So tell us a little bit about what happened. I know that it culminated in a key moment in 2003, but what happened in the lead up to that, and tell us what was going on.
Well, it sort of started off in 97 when Nathan, who was just 3.5, had been really ill for about a year, and eventually was taken into hospital, and they found he had a hernia. But while they were sort of doing that operation, they found out he had a B-cell lymphoma. So we then had to go down that path of sort of chemo, and they sort of tried to shrink it a bit, but he was quite ill at the time, and they really didn't know how he was going to sort of cope with all the operation. And then when they did operate, within 2 weeks, it was quite dramatic, and the wound exploded, and they had to do another emergency operation. And we had the anaesthetist and the surgeon saying, we really don't think he's going to make it.
Wow.
So, that was obviously a real test of our faith then.
Wow.
And a lot of prayer went into that. And it was lovely. Just about 3 hours into the operation, the surgeon came up to see us because we were in the parents' waiting room, almost in tears, and we suddenly thought, and he said he's fine,
Wow.
and they'd managed to operate, and he made a complete full recovery.
Wow.
So, but while he was obviously they had to give him some sort of mild chemo afterwards, just sort of to cover themselves and to make sure he was okay. But they picked up that Josh had some. His hemoglobin was, very, very low. So he was then under some treatment for a couple of years. And then this sort of went on for about 4 or 5 years. And then eventually they sort of said, we think we need to send you to Great Ormond Street as a family, and, for them to look into it a bit more and just see what's going on. And then that's when we went up to Great Ormond Street in 2003 in the May. But then actually it wasn't until November that's when we were called back, and then we were told that all 4 boys had this X-linked lymphoproliferative disease.
Wow.
And we were told that they'd all need bone marrow transplants.
That must have been pretty
I remember coming home on the old rickety train from Waterloo, thinking,
We just sat there, didn't we?
just the numbness that kind of goes in is very hard to describe. I mean, first of all, we didn't really know what a bone marrow, or we now call it a stem cell transplant, entailed. We had, there was the level of naivety there that we were soon to become world experts in, but it was just, there was an element of numbness. And I think what Gosh did, which was really good, is they said, look, come back in January. Bring your questions. I think I had about 115 questions. Still got the list, actually. And they gave us a long time to digest it. And for us, it was just it was a starting to process that there was something very serious. We gathered there was something very serious. We now had a name to it. There was a potential treatment, but as we started to go onto the internet and look at what it meant, it looked very bleak. And pure probability theory of an X-linked condition suggests that that it should be 50% each boy, so it's to get 4 heads is 6.25%. Any statisticians out there? And we knew that there was a very high mortality rate. The condition is ultra rare. It's about a 1 in a million incidence, and it's simply a single gene defect, which means that boys, and Allison has XLP, but she's absolutely fine because she has 2 X chromosomes. But for boys that are born with it and inherit that faulty X chromosome, it means they have no resistance to the Epstein-Barr virus, glandular fever, and the prognosis is that boys with it, the vast majority, will not make their teenage years. And so it was just the worst of times, really.
And Josh had really deteriorated around that time as well, because we'd sort of gone away, I think, in the October, and he'd sort of caught one of these super flu bugs, and he'd sort of really, his body obviously just couldn't cope with it, sort of his immune system, and so he'd really sort of gone downhill, and his sort of digestive system was all sort of gradually sort of back not really.
Wow.
And he was sort of on a special sort of milk diet. So to sort of, in some ways, have that answer in November, in some ways was a relief, because we thought, gosh, yes, you know, we knew something desperate was wrong with them, but then on the other hand, to actually have all four of them have the condition was, you know, quite a lot to get around our heads around, really, wasn't it?
Mm. Yeah.
Wow.
Hello and welcome to South Today. Tonight, the story of these four brothers. They all have a rare genetic disease which can be fatal.
It is your worst nightmare. There's no doubt that, I can't put it any other way. It's the worst nightmare for any parent.
But there is a cure, and we'll be telling you how you might be able to help.
So obviously you've talked about how serious a disease it is, and you said there was some sort of a cure? What were you told at the time?
So we were told that a bone marrow transplant, in effect, would replace the faulty immune system. And because we are, I think our pretty much our genetic makeup is somewhere between England, north of England, Scotland and Ireland, the chances of finding for people with that background was reasonable. But we realised then that we were going to have to. Well, I think we realised as we came out of this that we had an unusual story. To say that all four of our sons needed to go through bone marrow transplants was obviously something that was very emotional, and the amount of media coverage we got was amazing. I mean, we had TV crews parked outside our house for significant periods of days and days, didn't we? But we also recognised that we needed to find bone marrow donors for our sons. But at the time, I think there was about 15,000 other people around the globe with different conditions, including leukemias and some of the other cancers and other similar primary immunodeficiency conditions that also needed a bone marrow transplant. So we recognised that using our story, we could encourage people to actually become bone marrow donors
for all sorts of different conditions.
All sorts of
things. Right.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, although it was for the Hartley boys, as it became known, if you sign up, if you're a good match, you could end up donating for anybody, literally anywhere in the world. And so we recognised that there was a potential for some amazing things to happen from that. And I mean, we've actually met families now whose sons or daughters have actually had a successful stem cell transplant because of our campaign, and literally attribute.
We could actually see it getting busier year after year as we were there with the boys, and it was
who spearheaded this campaign? Was that basically you guys?
Yeah. The Anthony Nolan Bone Marrow Registry were fantastic.
Right.
We had a dedicated person who worked with us, Alex, and she was marvellous. Still is a friend.
So, but you basically became a press officer as well.
Yeah. Well, I have a marketing background, so you know, I knew what I needed. We knew how to present the story in a positive way.
Yes.
But also to express the seriousness of the condition there is.
And so you became effectively local media stars for a while. And I didn't live around here then, but I've talked to people who did and who know of you or knew of you through the local media story.
With so much energy, it's difficult to believe these children have a rare genetic condition which affects their immune systems. It's called XLP, or X-linked lymphoproliferative disease.
It was described to us that XLP is like a time bomb, and that time bomb is ticking, and that means that things can go wrong and wrong potentially very rapidly. I think that's been one of the hardest things for us to accept, is that the kids are genuinely so well and look so healthy and are so full of life and are so normal, but actually they have this very rare and potentially devastating condition.
XLP is incredibly rare. It's been diagnosed in only 100 people in the world. 70% die before their 10th birthday if it's untreated.
It is your worst nightmare. There's no doubt that, I can't put it any other way. It's the worst nightmare for any parent. To be given such a hard position was awful, and there were many tears shed. What's the scenario today? You don't know.
What each boy needs is a bone marrow transplant. But there are 7,000 people waiting for transplants, and the chances of finding a match are 1,000 to 1.
We was just really sort of shell-shocked, obviously, by the diagnosis, and in some ways we obviously had lots of times when we just sort of cried and just got it out of our system, really. And I think the more we sort of did research, we sort of realised that there was a sort of light at the end of the tunnel for them, that really once they do have the bone marrow, they'll be fit and healthy and, sort of start growing and putting on weight and, developing normally as boys should, really.
So you obviously had this big launch where you were sort of trying to get a lot of bone marrow donors for lots of different people, and obviously in the middle of that looking for donors for your own boys as well. And how did that what happened over the next few years?
Well, we had a kind of quite a ridiculous coincidence, because you were Josh's donor.
I was actually Josh's. The week we found out, friends of ours that sort of run a local bookshop at the time, they wanted to sort of have this donor session because somebody had actually donated to herself the year before, and she was like, "Yes, this is really easy to do. We'll just maybe get 50 to 100 people that will turn up." And we literally had people queuing all down the high street. There was about 600-700 people that turned up to give
Over the Baptist
tested.
Church and
then sort of another place next door. And we had the local football team and the fire engine. They all came down, and that's really sort of when it just went sort of global, really.
And it was global.
Yes.
I had a friend of mine who's in South Africa who phoned me and says, "Dave, I think I've just seen you on television here."
Wow. Okay.
And friends in Finland who said we were featured on page 2 of the Finnish Telegraph. We just knew we had a story that could be a blessing and actually hopefully help us, because clearly we were desperate at that time.
But just the fact that I was actually a 9 out of 10 match for Josh in itself is quite unusual, because parents normally maybe a 5 out of 10 if that. So it came at the right time, because he needed it, so he was the first one about that May to go in.
Yeah.
So you then had a whole series of these bone marrow transplants over the next 3, 4, 5 years, something like that?
3 years.
3 years.
Right,
Put a year off in between because Josh had a bit of a relapse. So
right, okay.
Yeah, it was.
And Luke had 2, just because he's always awkward. His first bone marrow stem cell transplant didn't take. It was rejected.
Right, okay.
And during this time, as well, as Alison said, there's something called graft-versus-host disease, which is kind of where the new immune system looks at the body and goes, "You're not quite right," and attacks it. And we had a lot of that.
But we did have this situation at one point when Nathan was having his transplant, that Josh actually was at clinic one day and then ended up being admitted because he'd come down with a virus on his brain, so he was sort of forgetting things. So he was then admitted for about a month. So thankfully we were actually on the same ward, and Dave and I did see each other. But that was quite scary, because I had to be with Josh the whole time, because he would just get out of bed and forget what he was doing, and so yeah.
So you effectively decamped to Great Ormond Street for a matter of months.
Well, when things weren't quite as critical, we shared it. So we'd do 4 or 5 days at home, 4 or 5 days up at Gosh, and then the worst. I think there was a month when I didn't get home because of that situation with Josh and Nathan, and there was also a time at Luke's transplant when I broke my shoulder, which wasn't the best thing to do, and also a time at Christmas when you broke your ankle.
But I stayed up with Luke because I realised I could actually rest it and do nothing actually up there with him.
So it was pretty full on all the way through, wasn't it? Really.
And you spoke in the video about your faith in the middle of this, and you spoke about how you believed in God and you trusted in God, and that must have been a hard thing to even process, being Christians. I know you had a lot of support of your church, but it must have been hard to process. All this stuff is happening to our kids. There doesn't seem to be an explanation or a reason, maybe. And yet here we are in the middle of this really, really traumatic and difficult time. How did that work out with your faith? How did you even begin to process that stuff?
It's interesting. I'll start first, because when Nathan, when he had his B-cell lymphoma, I remember actually just before he went into hospital, probably about 2 weeks before he went in, and I was walking down our stairs one day, and God just gave me a picture of, I just felt I was drowning because it had been such a desperate year with him being ill, and I just felt God. I was walking down the stairs, just sort of going deeper and deeper into the water and just drowning, and God just sort of putting His hands down and just lifting my head, and just sort of keeping my head above the water. And just saying, look, just keep your eyes just focused on me, just look to me all the time.
Wow.
And in some ways, actually, that held us, you know, sort of all the way through. Really, we just kept saying, yes, Lord, you know, we don't know why this is happening. It's happened, but all we can do is trust you.
And very early on,
And
particularly.
that sounds easy to say now in
It's early
the light of things working out.
It was really
It
tough.
must have been really difficult.
It was, and I mean, you know, we gave the boys to God and said, if you choose to call them home, that's not what we want. But if you choose to call them home, then we will still get up and worship and love you. And I think, you know, my experience of faith is that it's almost at times of crisis when it becomes the most real. And there were times, I think, when we were almost physically held up, I think by the prayers of the saints, but also just by the presence of God. And in a way that, you know, we look back now and we go, wow, we actually kind of, that was us, that was our story. But God was at the centre, had to be, and remained at the centre of that. It was critical. And yeah, we were, you know, there were times when, I mean, for each of the boys during the transplant, there were times when they weren't certain they were going to die. They weren't certain they were going to live. There was one time in particular, I remember, and Nathan was having his transplant, and it was going fine, and then he had a reaction to a drug called cyclosporin that dampens the new immune system. It's a really important drug. It was pretty hairy, and they basically said, well, look, he's not long after having his what we call D-Day, donor day. The new immune system's now ripping through his body and we can't control it. So we're going to give him oral, but because of the chemo, his digestive system is shot to bits. He said, and we don't know if he's going to make it through the weekend.
Wow.
And so the magic number for the cyclosporin level was 15. And I think on the Friday when I went out, it was about 6.7. So there was a little bit of the IV stuff left in, and they were kind of not throwing stuff down him, but giving him large oral doses. And on Sunday, I just felt laid and his body was red with this rash, this grass-fed host disease rash. So I just prayed over him, and I just saw this rash disappear, and didn't think too much of it. I honestly didn't think too much of it at the time, because I didn't know how rashes and grass-fed host disease work. So he got through the day, and they came in on the Monday morning, took his bloods, and went away, and came rushing in the afternoon and said, it's 14.7. It's impossible.
Wow.
Sorry, even now it gets me. And
sure.
it wasn't 14.7, it was 15. It was just they didn't measure it correctly. I know that. Because God is perfect.
Wow.
We never saw the big miracle, did we, for, you know, the big miracle where a single gene. But we saw repeatedly times when things that could have gone dreadfully wrong didn't go wrong at all. Sorry,
and that's the thing that, you know, there were times when the doctors turned around and said, you know, that we don't know what to do. You know, we've come to the end of what we can do. And we're like, oh, okay, right.
Thank you.
We know what to do.
Thank you.
You know, we used to get, you know, so that's the time when we really used to pray and
Get on our knees,
and lots of people.
And at what point would you say that you were out of the woods, or how I mean, when did you?
Last summer.
I mean, how are the boys now?
I mean, it's only the last probably sort of 4 or 5 years possibly that,
I mean,
that things have got better-ish.
Yeah.
But then they've all still had underlying things. I mean, Josh has got problems with his joints and his mobility, and because he had this scleroderma in his feet and legs, and graft-versus-host disease. You know, obviously Luke had it in his bowel, and he's been left with alopecia, and he's still his immune system's still not 100%, so he has weekly infusions at home, which he does himself now. But
and so you still have to look out for immune type
Oh, really?
Not really. Well, they have been shielding. Yes, they have been shielding it to a certain extent.
We shielded for years, Nigel.
Yeah, so you're used to that.
Yeah. Easy.
I think it's been harder now because they're older and in their 20s.
Yeah,
trying
right.
Well, the pubs were shut, so that made quite a significant difference, I think, in terms of that.
And they all came down with high blood pressure as well.
Well, three of them.
Three of them did. Well, obviously, Luke was still on immunoglobulins, so that was had to be sorted out. But then again, Nathan, his just suddenly just went back to normal. But Daniel and Josh, they're still on treatment for that.
So living through all that you've lived through with your kids, I have 3 children. I've got most of them through teenage years, and I count that as a miracle. And yet we didn't have to live with anything like the stress and the uncertainty and all that you've just described. And honestly, I kind of think, gosh, that would be enough just to get through that. But on top of all of that, you also started a charity.
That's right.
In the sun, I can see you bleeding. In the sun, I can see you bleeding. In the wind.
So living through all that you've lived through with your kids, honestly, I kind of think, gosh, that would be enough just to get through that. But on top of all of that, you also started a charity.
That's right.
So tell us a bit about how that came about, and because that's obviously a big part of the story, the ongoing story.
Yeah. So during the first year we were at Great Ormond Street, there the Institute of Child Health, which is the research side, in their annual report did a paper on XLP, and there was an article on our sons on one side, and on the other side they talked about that this is still a relatively unknown
Is this the one that's
condition.
called The Secret Killer?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's on the website.
I found it. I was looking at it.
It's on the website. And the silent killer.
The silent killer. Yeah.
And because most families get a diagnosis of XLP after a boy has died. I mean, that's just the unfortunate reality of it, like XLP1 as it is now. And so I read this article, and at the end of it, Dr. Bobby Gasper, Professor Dr. Bobby Gasper, actually said, we think this is a candidate for gene therapy. So I went in to see Bobby. We got on very well, and I said, so what do you need? And so he told me a very large sum of money. I said, okay, I'll get that for you. No idea how to do it. And so we had some amazing series of amazing coincidences, and I met one lady in particular, another doctor who was helped set up a similar charity for a similar condition. And so we decided to set up a proper bona fide medical research charity, and we've been running that I think for 13 years now.
Which is called
the
XLP
XLP Research Trust, www.xlpresearchtrust.org. And the other driver behind that is there was nothing on the web apart from a lot of very detailed medical papers that for lay people were very hard to understand. Because of our story, we had an old website that we used to diverge the news through, which no longer exists. And so other XLP families from around the globe started to get in touch with us, and we started to get their stories. And I just felt God was saying to us, this is your community, these are your people, this is your tribe. And you can make the difference. And so we set this, we're the co-founders, along with some other wonderful people who are still trustees and others that have been and have moved away. And the charity exists for 3 reasons. It exists to fund medical research into XLP, now XLP1 and Zyab, or XLP2. It's there to be a place where XLP families and those affected can talk to other people, and that's primarily us. We have a dedicated phone line for that, and it's also to do advocacy work with other organisations that are around around the primary immunodeficiency piece.
And so just talk to me about the families. How many families are we talking about in the world?
We've been in touch now probably with about 120, 130 families from literally across the world, from pretty much every country, every racial background, every ethnic background. No.
And that's how rare this condition is. We're talking just over 100 people in the whole world. I mean,
families. So,
families.
A family may have
Fair
8 to 30 boys affected by XLPs. But so XLP1, which is the condition our boys have, is a rare condition. It's a 1 in a million incidence, and there's a similar condition that we now support, which was originally called XLP2 and now ZIAP, which is about 1 in 5 million incidents.
Wow, so it's even more rare.
Yeah, but actually the incidence of it is, they're finding more and more cases. We funded some research in Paris to help clone the gene, basically, or the defective gene for ZIAP, and as a result of that, they've been able to find many more.
So how often do you find yourself talking to other families? Is it sort of every week? Is it every month? Or
it comes and goes quite literally. Sometimes it can be quite intensive with a family, particularly when they're newly diagnosed, because they just have these questions.
Because they're looking for anybody else who's got any kind of a similar
experience. And often, the email arrives in Turkish.
Okay.
And so, fortunately, my full-time job is working for a software company, and so I have friends literally who do simultaneous translations of emails for me. So I'll receive an email in Turkish, I'll contact a friend, send them the email, they'll send me a response back pretty much instantaneous. I'll then write a response in English, they'll send it me back in Turkish, I'll email it, the family will respond, and then we go through this process.
And I noticed that your website is in 12 different...
14 languages.
14 different languages.
Yeah, and American English. That's just a little joke, sorry. But I'm very fortunate that my full-time job kind of allows me to both travel a lot, so I can spend evenings working all prior to COVID. But also I've got this amazing network of friends around the globe who get exposed to XLP, because I say, hey, I need a bit of help with this family. And I've also been able to use my travels at times to say hello to families as well. It's not always worked, but sometimes we've done that.
And tell us about the research part.
Yeah, we funded research. It's on the website in Switzerland. The most recent one was in Switzerland on ZIAP. Paris, 3-4 programs in the US, 2 programs down in Australia.
So this is paying researchers to fund their studies so that they can find out more about how to treat. Because medical research is hugely expensive, and you'll be aware of that from what's going on with COVID at the moment, we deliberately fund what we call seed programs, which are small, innovative ideas about tackling an aspect of XLP1 or ZIAP, with the hope that will then allow them to go and get literally the millions of dollars or the millions of pounds or the millions of euros to take that program on, for example, into gene therapy for XLP1. And you also run these symposiums.
That's right, yeah.
And you've got one coming up. So tell us a bit about what happens there.
So we did this. I think we did it literally. We've got our 6th biannual one coming up in October. Now virtual, of course. But so it was 12 years ago we did the first one, and we had people who flew in from Japan, Australia, States, Italy, Spain, Germany, France. Oh yeah, of course the guys from France, and they gave papers, and actually it was really interesting. It actually started a community of people that actually started to talk to each other. And bits of the jigsaw puzzle about XLP started to be put into place as a result of these. And we sat there.
But what was exciting, actually, when we broke for even just the first coffee break that morning, I remember we sort of stood at the edge of the room, and you could just see them all just chattering to each other, and that was just so encouraging for us to think that we managed to be able to get all these sort of clinicians and researchers from all over the world together just to share their ideas, and
and a lot of them become personal friends.
Wow. And so
both of us failed our biology O level. The personal bit about the charity was we didn't want another family to go through what we went through.
And all the side effects,
and
really,
all the
that come
particularly the side
from
effects that
transplants.
come. So the gene therapy, this thing that Dr. Bobby Gasper spoke about in the Institute of Child Health, was the thing that kept me awake at night and drove me, and so we will be announcing that actually we now have clinical approval for this to be used in London, the Institute of Child Health, University College London, Great Ormond Street, wonderful people, the Leukemia Trust for the big money, so that other boys won't have to go through stem cell transplants. It's going to take some time for this to roll out globally, but it's gone through all the various tests, the modelling, and the various trials that need to. And we're very pleased to announce that. So there's some huge advantages, because for some XLP boys can't find a suitable donor, often because of their ethnic backgrounds, sometimes mixed ethnic backgrounds.
And so what's gene therapy? What does it enable?
So gene therapy still means there's an element of chemotherapy, still knocks out the immune system. Usually it's a low dosage chemo. They take out some of the defective cells. They correct the cell using the retrovirus, won't go into that, and multiply it and then infuse that back into the boy. And the early problems with gene therapy were around how that then goes back into, but that's now been corrected again. Very, very, very clever people. And so it means that boys that go through gene therapy won't get graft-versus-host disease. They are their own donors.
Wow.
They don't have to have the very heavy conditioning chemotherapy, and so the survival rate and the potential for them to not have side effects is hugely reduced.
Wow. So let me get this right. You spoke to that guy Bobby, who said, "I need loads and loads of money,
quarter million quid,
to take that research forward about gene therapy, to make that a reality." And I think, did he say something like this will work, it just needs it could work? Or
I think even back, gene therapy is still the great white hope in many for many conditions, and many varied conditions. It's still very much an emerging science and field, and there's been some really big setbacks. I mentioned whereabout they put the gene back, but that's now solved. So it was almost, I think, slightly tongue-in-cheek, and we funded programs that supported ultimately them going. It cost a lot more than that. Going to get
the seed money to get the thing started, and 12 years down the line, you can announce that they're now ready to use that as a clinical.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
That's awesome. That's honestly awesome.
It's quite good, isn't it? I guess
it'll hit little medical research charity you're running out of your house in Romsey.
Out of a very old desktop at the top roof of our house. Yeah.
And actually, the other amazing thing as well is that when we first went up to Great Ormond Street, it took about 6 months, because we went up in the May, and then we actually didn't get told until in November. But it turned out that the actual, I've forgotten the name of the machine's called. The particular machine that they sort of used to test it had actually broken. That's why it took so long. But now, because of the blood they took from me, they're actually able to test it within 24 hours.
Wow.
So even when we were up sort of doing some of the transplants, they were actually testing, some boys were coming into clinic and they were able to test them. And we actually did meet a couple of sort of boys that did have XLP.
Wow.
And got early diagnosis. That was really important as well.
Yeah, so that was just really encouraging.
So it seems to me that you've made a massive difference to the people who've been experiencing similar to how you experienced, just the kind of diagnosis and the kind of questions and the the processing and the, oh my gosh, what does this mean? And you've been able to bring those people together and provide support and information and make sure that no other family has to go through the same experience that you did with.
So the first bit, the other bit is now coming. The hope is that as gene therapy is made more available outside the UK, and certainly that will happen. But it was, we also send out icky bears, teddy bears to the boys, because often an XLP family will never meet, apart from within their own family unit, will never meet another XLP family. So, I think that's possibly, it is ultra rare, but we know that this community we're called to is a desperate community, because we've been there. We've walked the walk, and we hope that we hope we are hope bringers into that community and can bring life into that community.
That's
It's like you
amazing.
say, even just being able to connect with other families that are going through exactly the same thing. It's, you know, we used to find sometimes we used to come home and it'd be really difficult just talking to normal people, not normal people, but, you know,
Normal
friends,
people.
just friends, because they just didn't
Had
have
no
a clue
concept.
what we were going through. And I know certainly like during Luke's transplant, I actually met up with about 12 mums, and we all just really clicked, and actually even all the doctors and nurses said it's never happened before, but we all just really clicked and just were able to support each other, and you know, but I mean that had a knock-on effect, because only about 4 of the children actually survived out of 12.
Wow.
So that was, you know, quite hard, just, you know, coping and, you know, being there and supporting sort of grieving parents.
Yeah, and it's you know, and people are. This is a desperate community. You know, we talk about being called into bringers of life as followers of Jesus, and that to us has always been the motivation behind this. You know, it is a medical research charity. We don't give. We're not allowed to give medical advice, and we don't give, but we can bring hope, and we can share our experiences, and we can share. So, for example, we've had a couple of families where they've lost a boy to XLP. The mother is pregnant again. They can do in vitro testing. They found out it's got XLP1, and the question is, do they terminate or not? And we've been able to share that even with using for babies having stem cell transplants, you know, the survival rate is in the high 90s.
Wow.
Because the immune system is not developed, and we've been able to, you know, bring life. And in fact actually help just by presenting that facts, and
Quite literally bring life.
also save life, I suppose, as well as probably the other thing as well. And we've had, I mean, I've certainly had the opportunity to pray with a number of the families. We don't push it, but a lot of them ask, and it's on the website. In our story we talk about the fact we're committed Christians. We're not ever going to hide that. And we've had people that have asked for prayer, and we've done that over the phone, sometimes via email as well. It really is a, you know, it's, I've always believed that God is not in the curse, He is in the blessing, and you have to look for what the blessing is. And sometimes when you're really down, and the people listening to this that are going through awful situations, you've got to look for what God is doing in this, and God is steadfast. He weeps with us. I literally, there's a Ren Collective song that talks about that. And actually when I read it, I went, oh, my story. That's just my story. There was times when I almost felt the tears of God on my shoulder, in the depths of the depths, really. But He is faithful, and you know, you have a choice in the dark times. You either run, particularly for us males, you know, it's fight or flight. You either run or you fight. And I chose to stand and fight with God. Not fight with God, but fight with God alongside me. And if He is for us, literally, who can be against? But I also want to be clear in that as well, in that, you know, there was we were very fortunate that our sons came through and are doing really well today, and they're living lives, and you know, even with the complications. But even if that hadn't been the case, it wouldn't have changed where we ended up. We were fortunate. There was no magic here that because we're Christians, you know, that He saved us. I often said, when we were on Songs of Praise and the Heaven and Earth show and all this stuff, and I was being interviewed by the Sun newspaper and all this strange stuff, I often said, you know, as a Christian, God doesn't bubble wrap us. You know, we are as open to stuff as anybody else, and that was really important. Really, really important.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to share?
No, I think they said it all very nicely. I think, I mean, just realising that whatever we go through, we all go through trials and, you know, times of testing, and it's knowing that God is there with us. He walks with us, and it is just, you know, like the picture I had all those years ago. It's just looking to God, and He will, you know, He'll hold our head up high, and we just need to look to Him.
Guys, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I really, really appreciate it. I know that people who didn't know your story, and even people who do, will be encouraged by what you have to say. So I just want to thank you for doing that today.
It's okay.
Pleasure.